Losing my brother was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Have I lived through the things that I wanted to do? Did I push for them? And if I did, is there a goal on top of that? Or is there something that comes out of that I now know I can do? He was diagnosed with amoebic dysentery. So I said, what did they use to cure you? He said, arsenic. I said, yeah, I said, no way. And he said, yes way. So I researched. And in 1943, there was no such thing as penicillin.
Happy birthday to you. What is up, guys? Welcome back to the No Half Cakes podcast. My name is Jim Sabelko, and I am honored to have you here with me today because today is an amazing conversation with a dear friend. We're going to talk about running stop signs. We're going to talk about sacred joy. We're going to talk about death and dealing with that. There's a lot that goes in this conversation. I've learned a lot in this little brief. Let's not use that one. Try that over again. What is up, guys? Welcome back to No Half Cakes podcast. My name is Jim Sabelko, and I'm honored to have you here with me today because today is an awesome conversation with a dear friend. We talk about the danger of running stop signs. We talk about finding sacred joy. We talk about dealing with death. It is an amazing conversation from start to finish. A lot of depth and just a lot of amazing insights there. Something that I'm sure you are going to take away from and really find a new appreciation for life and the relationships around you. And I'm confident that once you go through this and have these conversations, which we'll talk about here in a second, you're going to have that deeper relationship with your friends, your family, the people around you, and be able to experience those relationships at a deeper level than ever before. So without further ado, let's hop into this conversation with my dear friend, Yvonne Caputo.
I'm good.
I'm really super pumped that you're here. I appreciate you being here so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So am I.
Yeah, it means a lot. I was looking a bit into, the details you shared and the story you shared, and it really is an amazing story. I love kind of how you shared about, the lessons you learned from your dad. And I really am excited to hear more about that and kind of like growing up through that and the transition process. Could you take me a little bit through that, what that journey was like?
Sure. My father was greatest generation. And that meant there was a roof over our head and food on the table. And he slept right down the hall every night. I mean, he was always there. With my brothers, the connection was fishing and hunting and sports, none of which I cared about. And so there was this distance. And looking back on it, I'm not quite sure that Dad knew what to do with girls. He was perfectly comfortable with his sons, but his daughters not so much. And so we used to argue. I'd be on one side of an issue and he'd be on the other side. And in my 30s, my mother said, your dad's not coming to you. You need to go to your dad.
So you guys were having a bit of a disagreement that kind of pushed you apart?
It was a disagreement based on a distance, just a distance between us. So I started to not talk about things that I knew would rile him, to get advice from him on cars, to get advice from him on how to build in my closet, to do the kinds of things that I knew would connect with him. Then in 2008, he and I were on the phone, and he told me this quirky, funny, off-the-wall story of all things, making an emergency landing in a B-24 in Fried, Belgium. Their third engine was out. And this is the engine that controls the hydraulics. So once he finished with this story, I said, let me get a pencil and paper. Jim, his exact words were, what the hell do you want to do that for? I said, this is really good. This is maybe something that the family would like to have. The very next week, I can't tell you what it was, but the first thing that came out of my mouth on our weekly phone call was, Dad, if you're willing, tell me more. And He did. Story after story came rolling off of his tongue. I kept taking notes. At some point, I thought, I've got a book. Because his experiences during the war were so unique. Not unique worldwide, but unique to him as an individual. And of course, individuals would have these unique experiences in the war. And I took the first draft of the book home to my hometown where he was in the hospital. That was his Christmas present. And that was his last Christmas.
Wow.
When I went to leave the hospital, I said to him, I just want you to know how proud I am of you. And here again, what the hell for? And I said, your service during World War II. And he said, no, honey, I'm proud of you. You wrote the book. So the writing of that book was the bridge that gave me the relationship with my father that I always wanted. He came to trust me in a way that I always wanted to be trusted. And we had the relationship. I say frequently, I got the father I always wanted, and he got a daughter that he didn't know he had.
So kind of what I'm hearing you say a little bit there is the initial part of that relationship growing up, there was sort of an uneasiness of, I don't know how to be a dad to a daughter. I'm going to do what I think is best, and sort of the same thing for you to him. But as you both grew closer and sort of gave up that charade or trying to fit the mold and just understood each other more authentically, that relationship got a bit deeper.
So deep that fast forward a year or so, I live on the eastern side of Pennsylvania. Dad lived on the northwest. We went home to visit him for Christmas, and he was in the hospital. And when I left the hospital, I told the social worker, said, when can we send your dad home? I said, well, whenever he's ready. There was a homemaker that was taking care of him. Everything was always taken care of. He had plenty of help. And we drove back, and I wasn't in the house more than 2 hours when he was on the phone screaming. Why did you tell them I could go home? So I just let him vent, held the phone out here. And when he finished, I said, Dad, what I said was you could go home when you were ready, and it doesn't sound like you're ready. And he got very quiet. And he said, Yvonne, I'm sorry I yelled at you. First time in my life those words ever came out. And he said, can you come home? I'm scared. I said, I'll be there tomorrow. And I also said to him, Dad, we're going to have to go away from plan A and go to plan B. I don't think you can live alone anymore. And his response was, I know. So I got on the phone and called a friend and got somebody to stay with him overnight. Also got his medications, which gave him a ton of relief. I walked through the door at 4:30 in the afternoon, and he was gone at 6:30. He waited for me to come home. It is wild. And in the process of us growing closer, and in the process at the time of me working in a retirement community, I had seen all too well with some of our residents what happened when they didn't have legal paperwork called an advance directive. And that's the paperwork that assigns somebody as a healthcare agent and then goes through a list of things. I don't want this. I want that. I don't want this. And Dad and I had done that. He said to me, if I don't have 75% of my life, then I want to go. If I can't, I don't want to be a vegetable. I don't want to be laying in bed. I just want to go. And he had gotten to the point, he was a brittle diabetic, where that was looking more and more appealing all the time. So he made me his healthcare agent, like I said. So he gave me the right to speak for him if he couldn't speak for himself. We found him on the floor. We called the EMTs. The EMT said it wasn't looking good. I called the hospital because they had a do not resuscitate order on Dad's chart. That was something that I made sure was there every time he went to the hospital. And luckily, the emergency room doctor called and told the EMTs, you can stop working on him. So I laid down beside him, put my arm over his chest, whispered in his ear that I loved him, that he was going home to Mom, which is what he wanted to do. And then I did what was the glue in our family, the Lord's Prayer. And he was gone. And that was something that he said frequently to me. Hun, I want to go feet first out of my own home. So the EMTs put him on a gurney, took him outside. It was snowing an inch an hour in northwestern Pennsylvania. The light from the open doors of the ambulance were shining on Dad's face. And there was this soft, sweet smile. And if you can imagine, I went, yes! And the EMTs looked at me like I hadn't had a head, or whatever head I had, it was gone. But we had done it. He wanted to go feet first out of his own home, and that's exactly what happened.
Wow, that's truly an amazing story. And I can't even imagine the feelings that you must have been going through in that moment, because there's this bit of joy and happiness that you've, accomplished his wishes. But I'm sure also this grief and sadness that now this journey is sort of come to an end. So what emotions do you go through in that moment?
All of those. And I'm also a psychotherapist. So when I'm going through all of these emotions, I know it's all normal. I know that there's nothing wrong, there's this dichotomy that I'm holding sorrow and joy in the same place. It has changed my grief journey with my father. And that's my passion for your audience. That by doing the hard work of going through an advance directive, and beyond that, a document called the 5 Wishes. And I'll talk about that a little later. But in going through having those hard conversations with our loved ones, we create a bond that's unbreakable. We give back to the loved one what it is that they're asking for. So in my grief journey, are there times when I melt into tears? You betcha. Just little things can come up. I know that's normal. But I also have what I call a sacred joy around my dad's death.
Describe that for me. What do you consider sacred joy? Because I'm interested in that term.
He trusted me to honor his final wishes. That was his gift. That trust was his gift. My gift to him was honoring his wishes. That sacred joy. I mean, I think of him now and just know that he went the way he wanted to. And he was ready. I mean, he was not afraid of dying. He had been, like I say, a navigator in World War II. He had faced death on multiple times. He was a brittle diabetic. He wasn't doing the things that he wanted to do. He was no longer allowed to drive. My mother had been gone 7 years. He missed her tremendously. Working with older adults, there's a time when they just get ready. My mom said to me 7 years before, she said, Yvonne, I want to go. I said, tell me about it. And she went through, I'm not doing what I like. I'm in pain all the time. I just sit here and watch TV. I'm ready. I want to go. So what I said to her was, and this is something that I said to Dad when he would bring it up, Talk to God. Between the two of you, you decide when you want that to happen. So that's where the joy comes from, of being able to sit with your loved ones and have those conversations. So many times when I was working in a retirement community, some resident would say it, and the staff would respond, "Oh, no, no, don't say that. We want to have you around. Oh, no, no, no. It's so much better to be alive. Hang in there." Well, they didn't want to. They were at that point in their life where life was too much and they were just ready for it to end. So I say it frequently, the elephant in the room. We've got a bunch of people sitting around. There's the elephant in the room. The tail is swinging. We can see it. We can walk underneath it. We can see it. The trunk is swaying back and forth. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's going to admit that there's an elephant in the room. It's an old Russian saying. And that's what death and dying is. We know it's going to happen. It's an eventuality for all of us. But do we prepare for it? So now I can tell you, my kids have my advance directive. We've had open discussions about what I want and what I don't want. So it's just something that we do as a family. And that creates a bond. So that's where the sacred joy comes from.
Do you think there's some level of freedom that comes from having those conversations where it's not something that you are afraid of, or your children are not afraid of, where it becomes a thing like, hey, it's natural, it's going to happen at some point, let's just be open and honest about it?
Absolutely. When I wrote the book, you have people who read the book for you so that they can give you reviews prior to the book being published. One of them was a young girl, and she got back to me and said, my parents have tried to have these conversations, and I've always pushed them away. She said, I'm not doing that now. I see from your book how important these conversations are. That's one. The second one is an older gentleman who did his 5 wishes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And he called his daughters and said, hey, my birthday's coming up. I want to do a Zoom call. We're going to talk about my 5 wishes. They went through the whole document, talked to him about it. They got to the point where he said, I want to be cremated. And one of the daughters said, well, what do you want us to do with your ashes? And he said, oh, I don't care. Throw them over a bridge. Don't bother. What does it mean by that point? And they said, well, there's the farm. Wouldn't you like us to take the ashes out to the farm where you grew up? Oh, that's too much trouble. Dad, if this is something he said, you really want to do that for me? And they said, yeah. So he went back and he wrote that into his 5 wishes. The most priceless was a woman who was in her 50s, acutely ill for years, always in pain, one surgery after another, trying to correct things that just weren't correctable. She got a copy of the 5 wishes and did it with her family. Her husband got in touch with us. She was in my writers group and said she's chosen hospice. So he set up Zoom calls for us to talk to her. And for 15 minutes, she just thanked me for the 5 wishes. Her family had sat down with her. They knew what she wanted. They knew she was ready. They were ready to take this step with her. She was just ready to go. Those kinds of anecdotes coming back to me are what is the book all about?
So let me ask you another question, because this has me thinking about a few years back, my own father had a bit of a health scare where he started going through this conversation with us where, one day he sat me down and said, hey, I've made a spreadsheet of all the important passwords that I have and all the important information so that if I'm not here, you have access to all this and you know what to do. And it got to the point for him that he was legitimately concerned about, hey, this might be the end. And having that conversation with him, although it's uncomfortable And right, you don't want to think about the fact that like your dad, someone you love, might not be here. But on the upside of that, going through that conversation allowed me to then now appreciate even more every day beyond that I got to spend with him and continue to spend with him. And I think for me personally, it gave me an appreciation that, hey, we've had that conversation. Now, after that, I can really enjoy every day because I'm not really worried about it anymore. I've got a newfound appreciation for this day. And you don't sort of take it for granted anymore, thinking that there's going to be an infinite supply more. How do you feel about that?
Oh, absolutely. After I did, well, first I learned by working in a retirement community what not having a state-sponsored advance directive did. It prolonged the life of somebody who didn't want her life prolonged. And so I called Dad and said, hey, I know you have a will. Do you have an advance directive? And he said, I don't know what that is. I said, well, if I make an appointment with an attorney, I'll go with you. Can we do it? And he said, sure. So an advance directive names the healthcare agent. Then it goes on. Do you want this? Tube feeding? Do you want to be intubated? All the kinds of questions that might happen should somebody become very, very ill at the end. And we went through each and every one of those. And Dad said yes to some and no to others, and no to most of them. Then fast forward a couple of years, I'm still working at the retirement community, and a document comes up called the 5 Wishes. And it's an advance directive with heart. It asks questions like, how do you want to be remembered? What do you want your children to know? What kind of a funeral do you want? And there was all this information that I didn't have in Dad's advance directive. So I went back to Meadville and we sat down and we did that for his funeral. My dad was Roman Catholic. He wanted a high mass with all the smells and bells. He wanted his nephews and grandsons to be his pallbearers. He said, whoever wants to read during the Mass, go ahead and choose whatever that you would like to read. Choose something that's familiar to you. He said, my husband has a beautiful tenor voice. He said, Kirk will sing. And Kirk will sing the Ave Maria, the Lord's Prayer, and Amazing Grace. And he said, and since you're taking voice lessons, you'll sing too. So, okay, Dad. So when we get to Father Gramada's office, my brother said, well, I don't really know how this works. And I said, well, here's what Dad wants. So that was the funeral. It was all the way he intended it to be. And on top of that, there was a section that about people standing up and telling stories about you during the funeral. And Dad said, if they haven't told it to my face, I don't want them telling it to me during the funeral. So put a line through that. And we put a line through a couple of other things that he didn't want. But the 5 wishes really guided the intricacies of those last days. I said to him, well, how do you want to be remembered? Oh, for my work with the Red Cross. So, well, what about World War II? And he said, well, that too. Well, that too. Like, a small part of his life. And then later on, much later on, when I was working on the second or third draft of the book, I started to get really intrigued. What do you mean by that? The Red Cross. What did he mean? So I made an appointment to go to the local office near Dad's home to find out my father had spent 41 years volunteering for the Red Cross. He was their president. He had done all these things that I had never known about. And so That's the kind of information that you can get when you sit down and do something like the five wishes.
Yeah, and I feel like what I'm hearing you say is it gives you a new level of appreciation that takes your relationship to another level of depth that although it's uncomfortable, right? So having this conversation or thinking about it, no one wants to think about losing someone they love, right? It's you want to just pretend that you have unlimited time remaining, and we're not going to think about this until the day I have to. But I think the encouragement here would be having these conversations as early as you can gives you a level of depth in the relationship that is impossible otherwise. Right? Do you agree?
Absolutely. My granddaughter was diagnosed with leukemia at the age of 17, and she was being treated in the Los Angeles Children's Hospital. She did the five wishes. Even at 17, they asked her to fill out that document so that her parents would know. They wouldn't have to guess about. I lost a brother when he was 26, and I clearly remember walking down the steps of the funeral home to pick out a casket. And we're wandering around looking at them, having no idea what Mark would have wanted, having no idea that Mark wanted to be buried. Maybe he wanted to be cremated. We just didn't know. So having all that information makes it so much easier.
Well, that's really amazing, especially considering a lot of people are not going to have these conversations until most people, let me say, aren't going to even think about having this conversation until it's too late or thereafter. So I'm hoping that some people get inspired by this and say, like, hey, maybe let's open up the topic and start thinking about what that looks like. And it's not something you don't want to speed up the process, right? No one wants to wish the end for someone earlier than need be. But I think that's the important part to understand here is you're not looking for the end to happen sooner. You're looking for just some clarity on, hey, when that eventually does happen, hopefully not for a long time, right? Not until you're ready, not until the time is right. But that doesn't prevent us from having that conversation now, even at 17 years old, right? You can have that conversation and those five wishes can change over time, right? So there's no harm in having that conversation and understanding deeply the wants and needs of someone you love.
I've done mine. Like I said, my children all have copies of it. I need to go back and review it. It's time for me to go back and review it. Do I still want the same things? Because time changes stuff. The five wishes itself is legal in 42 states, I believe. It's $5. And you can also order a booklet that helps you to bring up the subject of knowing what to say and how to say it, how to kind of prime the pump. The author of it, James Towie, worked with Mother Teresa in India. And this was his inspiration, having done that work with her, of helping people to prepare for the eventuality and making sure that it's sacred.
So let me ask you a totally different direction on this. Doing your five wishes yourself. So I'm 38 years old. Let's say I do mine tomorrow. Do you think it would give someone a perspective on, hey, what have I accomplished or what is my legacy up until today? And is that something that I can continue to change and develop years 39 and beyond? But if I'm not necessarily planning on going anytime soon, I've got another 50 years in me easy, ideally. But can that now give me a chance to look at, hey, what have I accomplished over the past 38 years? What is my current legacy? What am I looking to be remembered for? And is that something I want to continue to develop, or am I happy where I'm at? Do you think that's...
Oh, it does. It really does. The questions make you think. They really make you think about who you are and why you matter. And of course, that's going to change over time. It's bound to change over time. A long time ago, a professor in a class that I was taking said, your final project is to write your own obituary. It was a powerful, for me, it was really a powerful thing to do. Who was I? What did I stand for? What did I want out of life? Who did I want to be? What was important to me? So it's something that impacted my life, and I'm grateful that he had me do it.
Because then you could use that to sort of go back to, right, and see, are you aligned with that eventual obituary, right? Is that accurate?
Yeah. Did I do what I said I really wanted to do? Or reading it in this day and age, what has changed? Have I lived through the things that I wanted to do? Did I push for them? And if I did, is there a goal on top of that? Or is there something that comes out of that that I now know I can do? Not obviously for me, but being retired, I had no idea I was going to write 2 books. None whatsoever. It just kind of folded out into my lap. And so I'm really smiling a lot, in a sense that that's how my life turned when I least expected it. But the other piece of it was that when I was working on the first book, Flying with Dad, by the 4th chapter, I knew I had something. And I went exploring on the internet, and I couldn't find a book that had my twist to it. It wasn't so, yes, Dad did have battles, yes, he did go out. Yes, there were some scary things. But one of the stories, this is what got it going, Jim. They're in their B-24. The 3rd engine is out. They're calling ahead to free Belgium. They need to land. Belgium tells them to go on to Brussels because it's got a bigger depot. Dad says, he's the navigator, we're not going to make it that far. So they land in Liège. Liège is a hospital base. Now, this is something that I found out when I did research afterwards. It was a hospital base, which meant that they didn't have extra room for all these healthy guys that were coming off this battered plane. They got a truck. The truck took them into the center of Liège, above a bistro. So they were going to be camped out over a bar for their time, until the plane is repaired. The bistro owner comes to Dad and says, do you guys have cigarettes? And Dad said, of course we do. Cigarettes were a part of their sea ration package. Cigarettes were what bought them out of tricky places because they could barter them. There was nothing like having a pack of American cigarettes. So the bistro owner says, all right, come with me. In the middle of the night, they went out to a farm, hay bales in the fields, scraped those hay bales aside, dug underneath, and pulled out cases of French champagne. The cigarettes went for the champagne. The champagne was loaded on the plane when the plane was ready to go back to base. When it got to base, Dad went and got the MPs and said, guard this plane with your life. We've got top secret information aboard. They loaded the champagne into a truck and drove it to the non-commissioned officers club and to the officers club. The following morning, the commander of the base was really ticked because he had a whole bunch of men that were really hungover. However, all you need to do is breathe pure oxygen and you're ready to fly. That's the initial story. I'd never heard anything like that, this quirky, funny story. So the book is filled with them because those are the kinds of things that I wanted to know from Dad. What was particular to him? So that was the push.
Yeah, it's amazing to capture stories like that, because I think some of those stories are never really told, right? And often are lost because they never make the light of day.
Folks have asked me who've read the book, how did you get your dad to talk? Well, part of it was when I said, well, you started at the beginning. He started in high school. And it was 1939, knee deep in the Depression. No training. He graduated from high school, but no training. He lived with his two sisters that were employed in a coat factory, but one of them was going to get married. That meant down to one income, and it wasn't going to cut it. So Dad went to the welfare agency and said, I need to do something. Jobs were sometimes available, but they went to men with families, as they should have gone. So Dad was given a list of things that he could do for training. His finger goes down the list and he goes, boom, airplane repair. That's what I want to learn. And he told me, he said he built model airplanes from the time he was a kid. Now he could work on the real thing. So those are the initial stories. So he's telling me these, and by the time he gets to the point where he petitions to get out of his deferment, he never would have had to have gone. Getting in as a cadet, by the time he got to the hard stuff, he was so accustomed to talking to me and for me honoring whatever it was that he said, that he opened up. And then I began to hear the hard stuff. So it was little by little that this kind of adventure between the two of us happened.
Yeah, so you sort of built up some trust in, hey, let's start with the easy stories, the easy ones, right? And then develop into the little bit more depth as it became a little bit more comfortable. Seems to line up pretty well with how your relationship developed in that time period too, I think, right?
Yeah, that's really how it developed. And if I had followed my mother's advice 30 years earlier, I might not have waited so long. But I prize the fact that it happened. When he was in Miami Beach, he said, we were billeted in hotels, Yvonne. They were stripped down, but we were living in hotels. And I said, well, where was yours located? I don't know. Collins Avenue, and then he gave me another intersection. So Google can do pretty much anything. So I'm Googling to see if the hotel was still there. I sent him a picture. Nah, that's not the one. Picture number 2. Nah, that's not the one. Picture number 3. Picture number 4. That's it. The Beach Plaza Hotel. That's where I was billeted. Good work. Love you, Dad. And the other part of his being open with me was knowing the lengths that I would go to find out just exactly what the name of the place was. He also went on and said that when he was at Miami Beach, the best boot camp in the entire Army Air Corps, that he was out on the beach, calisthenics in the morning. He got the runs. He went over to the slit trench, dropped his drawers, fell in. Yeah, you don't see books out on the market with stories like this. And then guys, noticing that he was at the bottom of the slit trench, picked him up, threw him in the ocean so that they could put him on a cart and wheel him over to the emergency room. He was diagnosed with amoebic dysentery. So I said, what did they use to cure you? He said, arsenic. I said, no way. And he said, yes way. So I researched. And in 1943, there was no such thing as penicillin. It had been developed by the British. It was so expensive to make. They came over here because we had the resources to do it. And by 1945, when Dad left the war, he was taking penicillin if he had an infection. So those kinds of things kept coming up in the stories that he told me. And that was that was one of the reasons I wanted to have it published, is because the stories were just dynamite.
Yeah, there's so much depth to those that I think a lot of people don't understand or don't take the time to learn. It's fascinating. So I want to ask sort of a different variation here. You mentioned when we were talking initially about setting up this conversation how your husband is your best friend, right? How has that relationship between the two of you changed during this experience with your dad?
Kirk lost his mother when he was 10. His father had a stroke and lived for 7 years. His dad, read the New York Times from cover to cover every day. The stroke hit, he could no longer do that. So Kirk's experience with both mom and dad were different than what he had with my father. My father loved him. And Kirk would say that many times my father was the father to him that he never had. That kind of really warm relationship. And it's all because, too, Kirk went to ask my father for my hand in marriage. Okay, very old-fashioned. And my father said, "Oh, I'm so glad somebody's finally come along to take her off our hands." That kind of stuff was my dad. And Kirk really loved that, loved my father's corniness, loved my father's ability to talk and say sense, just loved the man, and Dad loved him. So he had, through Dad, an opportunity to experience a father in the way that he hadn't experienced with his own dad.
So you think that brought the two of you closer in your relationship and allowed you to share a little bit more authentic conversation together?
Obviously, I think I can say that we did from the beginning. He was blind date, came and picked me up in Hershey at a hotel, took me out to dinner. We just started to talk. It was the first time I'd ever met a man who was so interested in me, who I was, why I taught, who my family was, and the same. It was going back and forth. It went back and forth so much that our waitress was a little frustrated with us because we hadn't ordered yet. And when I went back to the hotel room, Kirk drove back and he said, "Why don't we go for a walk?" And so I went to change. I was with a roommate because we'd traveled down from Erie together. And I said to her, "He's got possibilities." And those possibilities came from the fact that he really didn't shy away from listening to me. And I can be loony, I'm not your average bear. And he can be too, but we appreciated from the get-go that looniness. So yeah, getting to know him was the adventure of finding my best friend.
That's amazing. I'm hearing a lot of commonality in depth of relationship and authenticity and listening to each other. I think there's a lot of parallels between your relationship with your husband and your relationship with your dad, about the ability to remove any preconceived notions of, hey, how it should be, and just be authentic and find out the true person on the other side. The listening and the sharing and the authentic communication have allowed a much better relationship to grow. I love that.
Yes, and I love my career path. I can say God had plans for me. And I first started out as a teacher. So I learned so much from my students that First of all, it's in the story. When I had a story, they learned so much more from that than the word on the page. Then I took a group of kids to England for an exchange visit. And we were together 24/7, and they fell apart on me, and I was clueless as to how to help them. So I came back and got a second master's degree in clinical psych. So then became a therapist. And then, as I said, worked in a nursing home. So this travel that I have done has been so helpful in terms of what's a good conversation, how to have a good conversation, learning to observe people, learning to sense when they're willing to talk, learning to when to not, knowing when to step in, knowing when to soothe. So I treasure my background in education and my career because they've helped me to have this really full life.
And I think also to look at the journey and the things that a lot of people would say were terrible experiences and find the joy from those experiences and how it's really brought you to this spot that you could actually enjoy and blossom from it.
I will tell people losing my brother was one of the best things that ever happened to me. And that sounds really crass and weird. But going through the grief process, missing him, taking a real turn in my own spirituality, what's important and what does all of this say? I really believe what you say is true. Life hands us lemons. Once we have the lemon, we have to make a choice. Are we going to be sour and bitter, or are we going to turn the lemons into lemonade? So I do appreciate, the tough things that have happened to me along the way because they've been teachers. And this, I do something with clients about negative feelings. I call them stop signs, internal stop signs. So I'll use you as a guinea pig.
Sure.
When you're in your car, what do you do when you get to a stop sign?
Stop, look both ways.
Good. Good. What do you do next?
You look around to make sure the path is clear.
Okay. Why do you do that?
To make sure that I am safe and people around me are safe.
Okay. Anger, anxiety, frustration, sorrow are meant to be internal stop signs. So if we're feeling one of those, to stop. Okay, what am I feeling? I'm angry. Why am I feeling angry? Well, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. What do I need to do to proceed safely? What do I need to do if I'm angry that will help me to continue to live to my values? So it's a way that piggybacks on what you're saying in terms of life lessons. But if I'm angry and I just pop, if I trigger, fight, flight, freeze, or play dead.
I'm visualizing when you said that the people who do not stop at the stop sign of anger are then surprised when they crash into another car and have this big emotional meltdown.
Yeah. Or they draw knives on the street because they're triggered. And when we're triggered, we now know neurologically that this part of our brain shuts down. It's the reasoning part, the prefrontal cortex. And if we ask ourselves, first of all, what's the emotion and name it, we're engaging that part of the brain. If we ask ourselves, why am I feeling it, we're engaging that part of the brain. If we're asking ourselves, how do I need to handle this, we're engaging that part of the brain. We're using our bodily mechanisms to navigate through tough stuff instead of fight, flight, freeze, or play dead.
Wow, that's a great visual. I will certainly remember that going forward. I love that. Thank you. So We're about out of time, so I just want to ask you kind of one last question here. Is there any way that we can best support you, or how can a listener really best pay you back or support you, or what advice would you have for them to kind of go forward in the best way possible?
Wow. Well, in terms of support, if they would like to reach out to me, my email address is simple: Yvonne author 4, all lowercase, at gmail.com. Of course, purchasing my books would be really helpful and reading them and leaving reviews. I would say the last piece that I just told you, if your listeners walked away with the idea that negative feelings are internal stop signs, and by the way, your very best friend, because your very, very best friend is there to get you to stop before you do something silly. If that's a takeaway for them, then I've done well.
I appreciate that. This has been an amazing conversation, and I just want to thank you so much for the work that you've done and continue to do in sharing this story. So I'm sure there's times where it's difficult to share that. It's very personal, it's very emotional, but I've gotten a lot out of it, and I know that people who are listening will as well. So again, just honor to you, and thank you for doing that.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you.